my name is Janet Archer. I'm the Chief Executive for Edinburgh Printmakers. And in case you don't already know, Edinburgh Printmakers was established in 1967 as the first open access print studio in Britain. We play a role in connecting artists to studios, workshops, and creative spaces nationally and internationally, enabling high quality printmaking and innovation in print practice. And I'm delighted to introduce Series 2 of The Art of Printmaking, which has run for 3 weeks on Wednesdays at 5 p.m. this autumn, well, winter, I should say. The focus of the series is SOLACE, which is our first members exhibition at Castle Mills. And SOLACE is running from the 23rd of November to the 24th of December, so you've still got an opportunity to see it if you haven't yet. It's produced by Edinburgh Printmakers. And this trio of discussions offers up a snapshot of Edinburgh Printmakers members' work on show in Gallery 1 and 2. It celebrates the diversity of work presented in this first members' show in our new building. So the exhibition reflects the solace that people have found in the arts over the past 18 months and the beauty of a form which provides deep satisfaction and joy for both makers and audiences. The pandemic's been a challenging time for all forms of artistic production, but especially printmaking, which requires physical processes. And members have been producing both in the studio where they can and at home using alternative workarounds. I'm pleased to say that many managed to get back to the studio in this last few months. We're still open now. Obviously, we're not sure what's going to happen after Christmas. But we're hoping very much that we can remain open and continue to build back in the way that we have been doing. The work in SOLACE spans print on paper, textiles and ceramics, and it culminates our programming for 2021. All the work is for sale, so if you're looking for Christmas presents, do make sure that you visit. And there are a few housekeeping points before we begin. So the event's being recorded. It's going to be uploaded onto our YouTube channel and website after tonight. So please note that the chat is disabled. You should use the Q&A to post your questions at any time during the conversation, and they'll be answered towards the end of the event. So without further ado, I want to introduce Tiffany Boyle, who's our program producer at Edinburgh Printmakers, who's going to lead the conversation over the next hour, and Edinburgh Printmakers members, Becky Lloyd, Jessica Crisp, Doreen Boogert and Scott Baxter. Tiffany, over to you.
Thank you very much, Janet, and a warm welcome to everyone. In terms of the structure for this evening, we are going to be walking through some short introductions from our members themselves, and we'll be starting with Scott, moving on to Doreen, Jessica, and then Becky. So I'm going to shortly hand over to them. After that, we will have some conversation until about 5:45, when we will open to the audience Q&A. And if you're in the audience and you'd like to ask a question, the way that works is there's a Q&A tab at the bottom. And if you type in your questions, and we'll come to those towards in the final section of this event. So without further ado, we're going to bring the slides on screen, and we're going to start with Scott, please. Over to you, Scott.
Hi, everyone. As I was introduced, my name is Scott Baxter, and I'm actually quite a recent member of Edinburgh Printmakers. I only joined fully in November, and so the SOLACE exhibition is actually my first exhibition with EP. I've had quite a circuitous route to where I am at the moment. I studied intermediate art at Edinburgh College of Art from 2011 to 2015, so technically I'm a mature student. And despite the kind of non-skill focus of my degree, I've always been interested in printmaking. It's something that I did throughout my degree, including etching and some litho, but I didn't actually get a chance to look into screen printing, which is where I'm actually working now. And so I was lucky. One of the ways to sort of cope with COVID was the EP started up their courses back in August and September this year. And so I managed to take a screen printing course to really explore some ideas I was considering might work very well in that sort of medium. And so I decided to look into the kind of work that I've been making over lockdown. I mean, for us, as been said, for many of it was a very tricky period, and also trying to look for inspiration, ideas, things to work with. I started essentially just working with things around me, including my friends, taking photographs, looking at the world around me as I was seeing it during COVID. And I think it was kind of interesting that the SOLACE exhibition came up as part of that. And so the series that I've made, as you can see here, I'll just introduce the two and I'll maybe flip back and forth. This is Rick 6 times. I'll explain why that is later. And the next slide, if someone could move me forward, is also Sam 6 times. And we can stay on that slide for a wee bit. And essentially, the work that I looked at is made in a very similar way. I started with photographs of friends, and I was kind of in my own studio, which is here, trying to work out what I was doing and trying to sort of think of what I could produce digitally as well as produce possibly in a printmaking way. But I'd prepared, when I was doing my course, I made a lot of images that I was very aware I could produce digitally and then almost be identical when I was making them as a screen print in separate screens. So I wanted to try and explore some ideas where I really wasn't sure what the outcome might be. I wasn't sure what the final works might look like. And so for this series, I've actually started developing more than just these two at the moment. Is I took the photographs of friends and I basically crushed photographs, rephotographed it, crushed them again, rephotographed it. And then over a process of 6 images, I created separate screens to be reprinted on top of each other as part of a screen printing process. This would go back into what I would call my methodology of working, of experimentation, of exploring a skill set like screen printing to find out what I could be making with it that may not necessarily be traditional or may not be obvious or in a kind of standard way of looking at how things work. And so for this series, I was very interested in allowing my friends to be photographed also how they wish to be photographed, and said, look, I'm just going to take a portrait of you. How do you want to? Some stood with their eyes closed, some stood with their back towards me, and some Sam here sort of seemed to be screaming at the ceiling kind of idea. So if we move back to, someone could move me back to Rick, the previous slide. So this is also the first one I made. And I found it really intriguing when I was seeing how this was emerging and what was becoming in focus, what was becoming out of focus, what was becoming layered, what was becoming darker, and what was remaining light. And I found it almost an intriguing sort of experience of how it can be to live through this time of COVID, of things that are in a sense sometimes frozen, but are also in a sense damaged and repeated, and kind of sometimes it doesn't feel that things are changing, but however they are actually a different day, a different week, a different month. So I felt that this kind of series of work sort of fitted very well with the SOLACE exhibition. I do have a number of other pieces which I'm now currently working on, and so hopefully I'll be creating a sort of a further series of portraiture or in this sort of methodology. And I think, and also the next step I'm looking at is possibly moving into using color and to see how the color, layers of color actually might interact with each other and how that might create even newer, different forms of printmaking that I'm not necessarily aware of going to be. And that's basically it. That's my kind of introduction to my work.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was great. I'm now going to hand over to Doreen, if we can move forward to Doreen's first slide. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Doreen. My preferred work is monotype, which I've done for about 7 years. I've done some other courses, but I always come back to monotype. So I thought I would just run you through it a little bit because I'm always asked, how do I do my work? So I thought I would just put up some different images here. The top left-hand corner one is actually in Edinburgh Printmakers, just to show you how I lay out my inks. I work with lithography inks, use an assortment of different rollers. And then we'll go down to the bottom left-hand one here with the 2 drawings. There's one, I photographed in the summer, in the winter, about February time, during our sort of early lockdown walk. I saw these sort of 3 female gooseanders who were all harassing this male, usually the other way around, but it just appealed to me. If you see in the photograph, I've only managed to capture 2 of the females and 1 male, and then I've added into a drawing, which I draw onto tracing paper. You can either sort of trace your image or add bits and pieces into it. I lay my work out. That was an A3 photograph that I had, and I just trace or draw onto the tracing paper. Then you've got to turn it over to reverse the image and place it under an A3 perspex sheet, which is 1.5 millimeters thick. Then you proceed to ink up your plate and work on the image. I use different cloths to wipe out areas, and also bamboo sticks, kebab sticks, the end of a paintbrush, cotton buds, etc. And then you put your paper onto the plate, then run it through the printing press, and this should then reverse your image back to the right way. So the next photo up on the top right-hand corner is now the finished print, which has 4 different coloured layers, and you can see how I've wiped out. The white is actually, I've just completely wiped out, and there's no white ink used. That's the paper showing through, and where I've used my little sticks to make marks. So that was the first one. Then the last one there is a ghost print that I took after you've run your first print through the printing press, this top one here. You're left with some ink on the plate. So put another sheet of paper on and run that through, and then you can continue either at that time or later on. You can continue to work up your next your ghost print. Now you can see by the time I've finished this one, again that was 4 layers. It's a much lighter print. It's actually quite different. So that's all of that one. Now, could I have slide 2 now, please? Now, the first photo on the left here is a print I made at Edinburgh Printmakers in between lockdown. It was in May this year. We were driving back from the Solway and we had a snowstorm. I'd been trying to use mark making in my work, and this was the result. And you can see where I've used quite a lot of lines to actually show the mark making, because there was a lot of water channels coming down. And that was that image. Then on the right hand side here, this is the last photo. It's the print that I have in the SOLACE exhibition, and this was the result of a cliff top walk on a really windy day, again in the Solway, looking down into a rock pool at Bulcari near Auchencairn. I was taken with the lines on the rock, and I decided not to confuse things by adding birds to it, and I used the side of my inked roller to show the marks of the water. This is the kind of roller I use, so I just make the shape, you know, to give the water of how it was all swirling round on the day. And this was the result, which I was pleased with. It's a bit of a moving away for me from actual, and it's a little bit more abstracty. So all my work I've shown today was printed at Edinburgh Printmakers as and when we were allowed in between lockdown. And I think that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doreen. And if we continue on to our next slide, it's Jessica, handing over to you.
Hi. I studied printmaking for my degree and graduated in 2007. And I've been a member of Edinburgh Printmakers since about 2010. in lots of different capacities. I worked for a long time in the studio as etching technician and then studio manager, and now I work freelance. The pieces I have in this exhibition are quite different from my usual work, although I always work with layering different processes together. So the pieces I have in the exhibition are dyed and printed and hemmed squares of silk, each piece dyed from gathered plant material and overlaid with screen printed text and drawing. I've been working with botanical printing and dyeing with silk and paper as a way of continuing my print practice during the successive lockdowns. I gathered plants on my walks around Edinburgh, and my dad posted eucalyptus and cotinus from the Highlands, where he's a gardener. So to begin with, I make a rusty iron-rich solution. So I just soak nails in the garden, and the rain and the nails over time make an iron-rich solution. And I soak the silk in that solution and then wind the silk round interleaved petals and leaves before steaming the bundles for hours in a tea urn. During the steaming process, the iron and the tannins in the plant material react to leave the light fast impressions on the silk. And then when the print studio was reopened, I took these reams of imprinted silk and started to play around with screen printing, layering the patterns, drawings, and text. And some of this text was from poems, some lyrics, and some of my own writing. So the tendency is, as the silk moves, to see flashes and sections rather than sequentially reading the passages of text, the repeats of the patterns, or the full compositions of the drawings. Can you go to slide 2, please? So this slide is a close-up of a few of the different pieces. Some of the silks have been made as a collaboration with the Scottish poet Samuel Tonge. With reference to Samuel Tonge's poem Seasonal, I worked with disconnected text collages, playing with the transparency of the silk and the opacity of the screen printed text alongside drawings. As the silk is held to the light, silhouettes appear, white text remains almost invisible until it catches the light. And you can see this on the top left and the bottom right image here. You can see the white text when it is dark and the sharpening, which when it catches the light is really visible. And when it's in a silhouette against light becomes darker. So I imagine these pieces enfolded into small envelopes and tucked into letterboxes with multiple uses for the recipient. Worn as scarves, used as wall hangings, tablecloths, or framed as prints. The imprints from the plants will darken or fade over time and exposure to light, gathering stains and wear from physical touch. Can you move to slide 3, please? So slide 3 is of the scarves hung as an immersive experience in a Georgian shop front. The small solitary space where people could walk through the suspended silks, moving through them like banners or flags, touch and brush up against the pieces, see the scarves suspended and overlapping, and experience the way that the light plays on their surfaces in person. And that's the last slide I've got. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. And last but not least, we're going to hand over to you, Becky, if we can move to our next slide as well.
Hi, thank you. Right, I mean, I'm also new to printmaking. I joined EP just back in August, but just to give you some context to this piece that I've got in the show, this was actually the kind of final piece we did for the printmaking course at Leith School of Art, which is a year-long course. It's a day a week. And I did it from 2019 to 2020. but of course it got curtailed by lockdown. So I kind of found myself at home with not very much. I don't have a space of my own. So this was very much about using what I had. I had a corner of the kitchen table. I had homeschooling teenagers at the other end. And I managed to get hold of lino. I managed to get hold of a wooden spoon to do some burnishing. And I bought a few of the Caligo water-based inks and managed to produce this work. So the way I did it, I'd been doing a lot of drawings of objects sort of in my home. They were things that kind of seemed to have meaning for me. They're things that I own, they're things that belong to me. But what I was finding is that they kind of, sometimes the kind of narrative behind them had got confused or lost, or sometimes I'd fabricated it. So I was very, very interested in producing images that kind of were sort of getting across this idea of a kind of a sort of unreliable narrator. If we could go to the next slide, I've got 4 kind of details of this work. So what I've actually done, these are lino cuts, which I produced from photographs I took of the objects. So, you know, I hand cut them by eye. There's bits of monoprint in there. So if you look, for example, at the hairbrush, you know, I've kind of taken some of the ink away in that to give it that kind of softer thing. The text itself is just trace monoprint. It was very much about what I could do at home. The text is found text. It's actually they're captions from illustrations from interiors magazines, and they kind of seem to suggest a story, a kind of tension, a kind of just, there's often a kind of something going on in the writing about interiors where with a lot of kind of unsaid things that I was trying to get across. I mean, if you bring up the next slide, I'll show you what I've been doing since I joined Edinburgh Printmakers. There was obviously a big gap between producing that work and actually being able to join as a new member. And so since I've joined, I've very much been kind of cramming courses. I've done Jessica's introduction to etching. I've done Bronwyn Slay's course. I did photoplate lithography with Matthew Wilson. And so these are just some of the images I'm continuing to work with the images, but I'm starting to explore different processes, basically. So these are very much works in development. So I think that's really all I have to say just now about my work. I think yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Becky. It's always so lovely to hear people talk about the work that's in the show, even though we, you know, had a kind of application process. It's always different to hear people talk through it themselves. If we can come back on screen, Alina, and I'm just going to start to pose some questions to you all. The first question that I wanted to ask everyone was that it seemed whether people, whether you all were new to printmaking or had been working in print for a long time, that there were innovations that were kind of forced by lockdown in a way, or perhaps I think a lot of people had kind of time also to perhaps do some reevaluation. And I guess what I was interested to ask is if there's anything that you thought from those experiments or new ways of working that you would want to keep on in your practice, even though the studio has now reopened.
I think it's kind of interesting for me. Well, I always like to kind of try different processes, but I've been doing a lot of botanical printing. So I kind of started working a lot more in my garden over lockdown, and I'm going to continue doing that. But another thing for me has been about connection with the audience. Always having been a printmaker, and making work and then selling it for relatively high prices in galleries, I've kind of reevaluated the accessibility of my work. So I kind of always felt, I just kind of started to feel more disconnected from the audiences. So it's been interesting for me making wearable work. And I kind of loved making the wearable work so much because I felt like people could just wear my scarves and then they could kind of interact with them every day, rather than having a print on a wall, which they never touched. And now I've started making more zines as well, because I'm interested in botanical printing on paper, but also because I'm interested in just making my print work a bit more accessible. So I've been making a lot of zines, distributing them to different places that I never really thought of before, bookshops rather than art galleries, selling them for really low prices, because I'm making much higher quantities and unlimited editions. So that's been like a massive change for me and something I'm quite interested in. For the first time, I've kind of started interacting with people that are buying my work, and it feels a bit more democratic. Yeah, so that's been interesting and something that I think I'll carry on.
I have to say that in terms of the install, one of the things that my only regret, I guess, about the show is just that when we were hanging your work, so we were like generally like it was around our shoulders and then we're working up at height, and the botanical, you get like there's very evocative smells that come off the work, and like each scarf is a little bit different. And that was like the only regret I had, is that the audience don't, when I was, the slides you had with the installation in Stockbridge, I think to walk through that is almost, I was thinking, oh gosh, I can think about how that would smell, but just because it's at such a height in Gallery 1, you don't get that. That's my only regret, just because they're beautiful smells. Was very maybe a tricky question, that one, to start with. Do you want to move on to another question? Everyone take a pass.
Well, I suppose, I'm in a very different position from Jessica. I'm new to printmaking. So for me, I kind of want to move on from what I did during lockdown. I might come back to it, but I feel just really, really hungry for new processes. I kind of know what I'm not interested in, but I kind of, I'm just desperate to have tools and to be in a studio space again. I think what I found most difficult was working from home. And although I'm kind of part of a printmaking community from my Leith School of Art course, it's so different from being in a studio, where, you can ask questions, you can just talk to people. I'm quite keen to move on from the kind of situation I was in working at home. I found it very difficult, actually. I think what it did do, though, it forced me to be creative. It forced me to solve problems, make decisions about my work. And it kind of really focused me and concentrated me, because I had kind of limited time to produce quite a substantial amount of work for a sort of end of year piece. So I think without that experience, I actually don't think I would be as good a printmaker as I am now, in having been forced to be creative. I think you can get slightly blinded by the tools that are available sometimes. So, I think just that, wooden spoon and some lino at home. And, I had the piece of glass from an old picture frame that I was using to roll my inks out on. And, it worked for me, but I'm also quite happy to be back in a studio with more sophisticated tools, basically.
Well, maybe I'll move on to my next question, which is that generally with the events we've been trying to gather quite a diverse cohort of speakers who maybe unexpectedly might share something between them. And one of the things that I was thinking about the way that each of you all work in diverse print mediums is a kind of particular kind of close reading, I felt. You seem to work in series or sequences as you kind of unfolded some kind of inquiry into your particular subject matter. So whether that's a series of portraits of acquaintances or particular landscapes that you return to. And I wondered if you could maybe say something about what, I think in these conversations we tend to focus on the print medium, but I think that there are other ways of working actually behind all of this. And I was wondering if you could perhaps say something about maybe what draws you to work in this kind of quite inquisitive manner, quite studious manner.
I'm happy to go first for that one. I will be speaking off the top of my head, so I haven't really considered this. But yeah, when I think about the work that I've been making, because I suppose sometimes it's not until we've made the work that we try and think about where it came from and how it's been made, and a bit of post-rationalizing. But I was very aware when working through lockdown, and I thought a lot, I mean, I'm not comparing myself, but I was thinking about the way that a lot of artists in the 60s and the 70s worked with very little medium, very little opportunities, and they would essentially walk around their studio. They would sort of start creating things based on what they saw, what they experienced on a daily basis. And I felt that was all the opportunity that I really had. I mean, I did not start with self-portraiture, which is something I'm not interested in doing. I'm not very good with that. But it got to a point where, you know, I think part of it was missing my friends, missing seeing the people I was part of, missing the kind of community that I was involved with. And so I felt it was quite an enjoyable part of my work was to ask my friends to be part of my work and to sort of represent them in their kind of experience of lockdown or their kind of experience of who they are as a person at the moment, because I don't know if the images that I've made would be any different if there was no lockdown. That if I'd gone into looking at portraiture in a sort of screen printed way, you know, 5 years ago, how would that have emerged? I mean, it's a very difficult one to sort of balance between what you think you're going through or what you are as an artist anyway, you know, that you would make. So, I mean, I think it was, I'm very pleased that I got an opportunity to work with friends, and it's something, sort of going back to the previous question, I'm likely to continue with, because I still feel my printmaking journey is very early. So I really don't know if I'm going forward or backwards, but I find myself enjoying the kind of process of working with people and then seeing what the printmaking process makes out of it.
Hi, well, I found it was quite difficult during lockdown, obviously being restricted in getting out and about. And at that time, my husband was actually waiting on an operation, and we were kind of going out for daily walks, maybe an hour at a time. And I live in Musselburgh, and particularly around about Musselburgh, we've really enjoyed the walks all round about Musselburgh, found areas that we hadn't explored before. And I've always been interested in wildlife, and it's not something that I've used in my work at all. So that's how I've ended with the observations of these ducks. And I quite like the ironic that that you see on the way as you walk about the place. So so that was good for me to try something different. Also, when Edinburgh Printmakers reopened, I did one of Kitty Jones's monoprint classes. I kept thinking I shouldn't be doing, because I do monoprints and monotypes most of the time, and I thought I should try something else. And then I thought, no, I'm going to see how someone else does their work. And it turned out to be a great course. I can recommend it highly. So, you know, for me, that's good. But also I found that I would watch things on Instagram or whatever, and people doing little courses. And I've found that I'm fascinated with mark making. And that's why my last two pieces have managed to develop myself into mark making. I don't want to be completely doing abstract work, but I just like the idea of exploring that and, you know, taking certain things out of it, because I think sometimes you put too much into paintings and whatnot. So really that was my experience of lockdown mainly.
I was just going to pick up on you said something about that you saw that several of us were sort of working in series, because that's something I find very hard not to do. And I think it's possibly, my background is in film, and that is just the way I think. I think in terms of a kind of a series. If I have an idea, it's always as part of a series. So I think that's just the way I always work. And it's just that kind of, it's to do with looking for the narrative in things, or trying to avoid the narrative in things, and trying to looking at the relationship between the kind of words and the images, and trying very hard not to make it too neat. But everything I do works like that. I think again, something I want to move into. I want to start working. I would like to be making zines. I want to start working with comics, with artist books, because I think that would be a sort of natural progression for my work. So at the moment, I think what I'm doing is kind of trying to contain something that possibly is a book, you know, within a series of prints. But yeah, I can see that there's quite a few people in the show whose work is kind of, even if it's only a sort of single 1 or 2 pieces they've got, I kind of know that they're part of a series. So that's an interesting observation.
Yeah, no, I think with that answer in mind, the captions that you've used, actually, you can see where those might have entered into the fold for you. I guess another question that I wanted to pose to everyone, and I hope that this won't be too intrusive a question, so feel free to also not answer. But I was aware that many of you have had other careers and have either kind of continued printmaking alongside that, or at some point decided that you will move towards printmaking. And I think that also seems to have been something that the lockdown, in terms of the wider EP community, some people have decided, I'm now going to be a full-time printmaker. And I think, you know, there was a lot of time during lockdown for reflecting on life decisions, I guess you could say. And I wondered if you might be willing to say something just about that decision to make a particular kind of commitment to printmaking as kind of a practice, or to, maybe about deciding to kind of make a move towards working in the studio in a more kind of full-time capacity, if that's not too intrusive a question.
No, I understand that one fully, because I felt, if anyone who's aware of the intermediate course at Edinburgh, it can be quite an ephemeral kind of very light touched form of art making, and it doesn't lend itself very well to objects in the real world sometimes. And I did find myself, and it took a number of years after I finished my courses to really find out the direction that I wanted to move in, the kind of art that I wanted to make, the kind of art that represented myself. And printmaking had always been at the back of my head as something that intrigued me, because one, you can make editions, you can make, you know, things that people might want to own. And it's also something that is consistently experimental and consistently changing. And there's always different forms of printmaking that if you've used one enough that you like, that you can move on to a different form of printmaking. And they all bring to the art world very, very different experiences. And I think printmaking seemed like a logical choice for me, because I'd always been interested in graphic work, the use of color in that sense, although my work at the moment doesn't really have much color in it. It felt for me a very natural move into things. And it was the one, also screen printing, it was almost like the thing that you're told most to do is the one you reject all the time. And people were telling me to do screen printing for many years, and I sort of refused, and I did etching and I did all this stuff. But I found a home with screen printing, very much so, working in the studios and the people that I work along with. So I found a sort of a good experience from my practice as well. So it's certainly where I am now. Not to say that I might change my sort of methodology in the future, but for now, it certainly is a very comfortable working experience for me.
You were talking about having different previous careers. Well, I was a chef. I owned my own restaurant for a great number of years, and ran a kitchen. How I did it, I'll never know. But so that really, I don't have a formal art background, but I got interested in art while I had the restaurant, and I started to go to the odd evening class, and then I had different tutors over the years, did evening classes at Edinburgh College of Art and, Leith School of Art, and just carried on. And I have always loved printmaking. I don't know what it is about it. I don't know whether it's because it's a process, like a bit like cooking. You end up with, well, anyway, I seem to be comfortable with printmaking. I paint as well, but I only do sort of part-time work. I try and go into Edinburgh Printmakers at least once a week, and just continually work away. And I would like now to try and start to maybe use some dry point along with, my monotypes. I do screen print occasionally, but I need to get back to some of these things. And now I do have a bit more time. I really would quite like to, to do more. But the thing about Edinburgh Printmakers is I have been welcomed in there. It's quite difficult for me when I started because I wasn't a trained artist. And Jessica in particular welcomed me in, and we became great friends. And I just love the people in there. And it's a joy to work in the actual studio and to have the space. And someone like me who's not had this training, I'm hoping that if anyone's watching tonight, it'll make them not as frightened to join, because it's the best place in the world to actually take courses. All the technicians are great too. So that's my experience.
Thanks, Doreen.
I suppose I haven't really thought this through yet, but for me, it's very much about complementing the other work that I do, which is working with writers. I work helping writers develop their stories, their feature films, their short films, and often working with kind of emerging filmmakers. And I find that I'm constantly bringing things that I'm thinking about when I'm making prints through to my teaching, for example, and it works both ways. I think it gives me enormous insight into the kind of the difficulties of creating something. I think strangely printmaking and writing and making film are not that dissimilar. It's like most things I've done. I've also studied architecture. I've got a history of art degree. I find that the synergies are far stronger than the kind of differences. So, I read about storytelling, I read about writing, and then I take that back into my own work, and the things that I'm learning, it's a two-way conversation. But I think to a certain extent, I keep them separate though. I think a lot of people I work with don't realize I make prints as well. And I think that's a slight difficulty I think we have as kind of professional practitioners in the creative industries, as you like, is I think you can sometimes be kind of pigeonholed as being one thing. And I think most of us aren't. I think there's very few people who would just say, I am a full-time printmaker. We're all doing it. We're all kind of, it's all gig economy. We're all doing a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of teaching and a bit of everything else. So, I see it all as being part of who I am. And, and printmaking seems to be the place where my creativity, if you like, my ideas are kind of finding a home at the moment. And I don't know what it is. I think I'm very drawn to things that have a sort of real technical side to them. I find that really appealing. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Becky. That was a really beautiful answer.
For me, printmaking is my it's my day job and my night job and everything. So I make my own prints, I teach printmaking, I'm a technician. I do lots of so I've worked for a long time for Edinburgh Printmakers in different roles. Now I work for Out of the Blue, and we have print studios. We have a Riso print studio, and we also have textiles printing facilities at Abbey Mount. So everything I do is kind of connected to printmaking. And yeah, it's great for me. I think like as a master printer, when you're working with artists and editioning their work, it's like a whole new level of problem solving, working with the print processes, because a lot of the time we have artists who don't really work in print and are wanting to express their ideas in print, so they're just doing crazy stuff. They don't know what the processes do, they just know what the image they want to be, and then we have to work out how we're going to make it work with the print processes. So there's loads of problem solving, and then coming into teaching as well, looking at students' work and their approaches and how their work is going to fit with the different processes, and problem solving for the students as well, trying to make the processes work for them, and think about how they could layer the different processes as well. I was just thinking about your prints when you were talking, Doreen. I was thinking it'd be so good to get you dry pointing on some of the perspex and then monoprinting on top. Be absolutely beautiful. But yeah, so printmaking has been for me everything since I was 17 at uni. So I'll probably carry on doing lots of different approaches to print.
Yeah, I think it's a whole other conversation, but I'm really interested in I guess like the sustainability. Like when you were talking about your work, I thought it must be like a very sustainable, like an environmentally friendly way perhaps to make work. And I thought that's a really interesting kind of question, but I'm very aware that I have actually asked really my quota of questions. I know that there's already some from the audience in the Q&A, so I'm gonna what am I wished and ask questions. So any audience members that have questions, please remember that you can type these in. So we've got 2 questions from Paul Fieldsend, and I'm going to read these out. And the first question is addressed to you all. So Paul has said, all of the speakers are using photography in various ways, and I wonder what comes first for each of you. Do you take a photo first with a view of how you might use it in print, or do you start with the idea of a visual print output, which then drives you to do what you do photographically?
Well, I think for me, I just randomly wander about, and if I see something that captures, the moment, I photograph it, and often then I work from it, or sometimes I do a sketch, at the same time. Just depends on where I am or how cold it is or whether I want to sit about. But my husband gets mad at me because I have so many photographs that I download, and he's always having to run out and buy colour cartridges. But I like to have loads of them so I can refer to. And it's amazing for me, I usually can look at something that I have photographed and think I could do something with this with a monoprint, and it takes it away from the actual photographing, and it does turn out quite kind of painterly like. So that's my experience.
I think I said earlier that I started working in a way that was very much representative of the photograph as a screen print, something that would be very visibly connected, but I realized that that's not how I wanted to be exploring printmaking. And although I do quite correctly start with photographs and I manipulate photographs and then I rephotograph, I was very much aware that I wanted to make sure that I was then printing, not sure what it would actually look like. All I had was a base ink that was very heavy with paste and very little pigment in it. And I want to just overprint and overprint and overprint and see what would emerge from the images. You can kind of do a version of that through Photoshop or manipulation, but the actual working with ink and paper and screens is quite a different process. And it creates a very different sort of experience of what might emerge. And so even though some of the early pieces that I worked on, I ended up changing versions of the manipulation, versions of how they were printed, versions of how I layered them, and that way allowed a process to develop on its own away from the photograph and very much as part of printmaking. And so I wanted to make sure that's where I was exploring the work further. So again, the photograph is a sort of a research piece, but then the printmaking is itself a way of making the image become a different thing.
Yeah, I'm not actually very sure how to answer that question, because I just arrived at using photographs as just part of the process. I had started with drawing objects, and I was finding, because I was quite skeptical about my relationship between me and the things I was drawing, that they seemed to be almost too emotional. There was too much mark making in my drawing, and I kind of was just trying to distance myself from the objects. And just put some space between me and them. And I also wanted them to feel kind of, when I was drawing, they were very grounded. They were very sort of, they were objects on a surface, with shadows. And I wanted the objects to feel more kind of disconnected and archetypal and abstract and just in space. And I just found that I could produce the kind of image I wanted by photographing them. And then obviously I've kind of moved away from that image again in terms of making the lino prints. But you'll notice I've gone back to using kind of with the etching and the photo litho. I'm moving back towards something that feels, I think, closer to the photograph. But I'm still absolutely playing around with those ideas and moving between them and trying to find, what works best for me. So it's very much just part of my development process. It's, it happened to be photographs I worked with for these.
I think for me, I use so my work kind of previous to these textiles pieces was a lot more photography based. I made a lot of lithographs and using process color with lithography as well, and then introducing drawn marks into those prints. And for those photographs, some were, as Doreen was talking about, kind of chance moments, which I'd photographed, and some had been carefully staged. And some I made pieces. I made a series of paper mache pieces, and then set up still lifes with lighting for those, and then photographed them, and then made lithographs from the photographs. Before lockdown, I was working on some photographs that I'd taken of textiles, because I kind of started to become really interested in textiles, really interested in kind of domestic items and still life, and its kind of connection with the female, the domestic, thinking about roles. So then I didn't actually finish the lithographs I was making of the textiles, and then I started making textiles, and now I'm photographing the textiles that I've made quite a lot as well. So I think alongside continuing to make my zines, make my textiles, I've been photographing them a lot. So I think probably when I start making lithographs again, I'm going to use some of the photographs that I've taken of the textiles. So it's quite circular for me. Sometimes it's incidental, sometimes the photographs that I've taken are carefully staged from items that I've made. Yeah.
So Paul asked a follow-on question, just for you, Jessica. So before you mute yourself, just hold on there. Which was, so Paul said that he visited your silk show, the one you're, I think, talking about
Yeah.
Bridge, and found being able to walk through the silks and immerse in the prints very calming and beautiful. How did the hanging process and being able to see the works filling a 3D space change your relationship to the pieces and process?
Yeah, that was really lovely for me, and it was the first time that I'd hung the silk at all. I spent like a couple of years making all these pieces, and I just had like reams and reams of them. So yeah, it was great to hang them and see the relationship with the space. I did a lot of photography when I was in the exhibition, and I think it kind of comes back to what I was talking about earlier, which is just about seeing people interact with my work and thinking that I wanted my work to be a bit less precious, like behind glass framed on a wall. And I wanted to kind of experiment with making work that was more tactile and that people could experience, they can wear, they can build a connection with. I'm interested in the way that the botanical prints will change over time as well, with the proximity to people's bodies and sweat and stains and how they react to the light. And a lot of that, I guess a lot of that impetus came from seeing the way that people interacted with the scarves in the exhibition I had, which was photographed in the last slide.
Thank you. So now I have a question from Claire Stevens, who has said, at least one of you, remaining anonymous, is a fully badged up, happy to help volunteer in the studio. And she would be interested to know what inspired you to volunteer, as this is very generous of you, and what has the experience been like for you, and do you get asked for help often? So I think this might be for Doreen.
Yes, I think it is. I was very happy to be asked to do this. I'm not technically, up on everything, but I know how to direct people in the right direction. It's often they're just looking for, where do I get a cloth? Where do I get my paper? Do I take my own paper? Or, and I then say, no, you don't touch the paper. You need to go and get a technician to do that. And so I find I like to chat, as you can tell. So it works very well for me, and people are so friendly. It's amazing. I watched a chat one day, and he was wondering about this bucket, and I just felt so sorry for him. It was obviously, there was no cloths left in it. So I was able to run and help him. And even when he was sort of laying out his work, he hadn't got proper sheeting to put underneath. And I said to him, look, I think if you try and get the right sheeting, I'll give you mine for today, and then you can see how things go. He was a College of Art graduate too, and here's me telling him. But anyway, it was fine, and he was thrilled to bits, even down to the simple way of how to tape your paper down, things like that. And I don't try and do anything too complicated, but seems to work quite well. And I quite often take home baking in, so everyone follows me about the place. I'm quite well liked for that. I think that's how I bribe people to help me.
Noted. Thank you very much. I'm very aware that we are dangerously close to our end of time, and I wondered if Janet was about to pop up on screen. Yeah. Hi, Janet.
Hello, I'm back. Thank you all so much for such an interesting conversation. As ever, I've just loved listening to what our members talk about, how you work and what your pulses are in terms of making your work. you've talked about colour. Scott, I'm fascinated to know what kind of colour choices you're going to make in the future, and what's going to drive you to making those choices. We've talked about creativity, which is at the centre of everything that all of you do. And I'm interested, Jess, in you reference problem solving, which of course is part of the art of creativity, and so useful, not just in terms of making prints, but in terms of everything that we all have to do every day. And we've talked about community, and the social aspect of the studio is really, really important. And once more, we've heard stories of how Doreen and Jess have become great friends through working in the studio. And I think the print studio is a really unique creative environment because you're working solo and in deeply in a way where you're working on your own work, but you're in a community environment. Becky, you talked about your audiences. Sorry, no, that was Jess. You were talking about audiences and thinking about how you place audiences, and you've been reflecting on that over lockdown, and thinking about your work in relation to audiences. And I think that's really important, because a print is something, whether it's something that you wear or whether it's something that you hang on a wall, it's something that you build a lifelong relationship with. On another occasion, I'd be fascinated to know how you think about audiences when you're making work, and whether you think about the work once it's left your domain, and the audience that the person who has either bought or had it gifted to them relates to it in the future. And I think, Becky, the point that you made, that often we pigeonhole people because of the way that we perceive them when we meet them, or because of the job that they do, sometimes stops us from thinking about the kind of whole extent of the whole person. It's been really fascinating getting to know you all, and the different things that you do and have done. And it's reminded me that it's absolutely something that we all need to remember, is that there's much behind all of us as individuals. And most of all, I just love the idea that printmaking is where my ideas are finding a home at the moment. Quoting Becky, I hope very much that Edinburgh Printmakers can be a place where all sorts of ideas can find a home in the future, as we work through this next phase of the organisation's existence. So thank you all. Thank you, Tiffany, for being such a brilliant host, and conversationalist in talking to everyone over these past 3 weeks. And thank you to Doreen and Becky and Jess and Scott for contributing tonight. I shall look forward to seeing your work in its next stage of journey. In the meantime, I wish you all the very best for the festive season. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.